Oh, it's so good to see you. So good to be together. Truth is reality as discovered by science and philosophy and as revealed in spiritual experience. Truth has a spiritual core, a scientific periphery, and a philosophical bridge between them. The truth that God is our Father. In our day and age, confronts the fact that talk of the fatherhood of God is unwelcome to large numbers of people. There are a number of reasons for this. One of the most important is that there are a lot of fathers who are bad parents and do horrible things to their children. And to insist on language against the repulsion of such victims and survivors of abuse. And we could carry the resolve not to risk hurting people by just erasing the father concept from our vocabulary. But there might be reasons not to erase it. The other reason that I want to address today why talk of God as Father is unwelcome in many circles around the world is that the last few generations of feminist thought and experience and writing and speaking has persuaded generations of educated, ethically sensitive persons that the father concept of God is sexist, at least if it's used apart from the motherhood of God. Oh, these problems are tangled. We might save the motherhood of God for another session. But today I'm going to share with you some selections from this book. As I see it on the screen, it looks backwards. Living in Truth, Beauty, and Goodness by a religious philosopher named Jeffrey Wattles. And I'm going to quote some passages and some footnotes, and then see if I should say a little bit about the motherhood of God in this session or wait until later. In the first chapter on scientific living, on page 23, there's a section titled Psychology After Reductionism. On the psychological level, we participate in evolution by personal growth. As we grow spiritually, we mature our concept of God and increasingly relate to others as family. Psychology, in the person of Sigmund Freud, put up roadblocks to the concept of God as our Father and the teaching that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Freud found that a child's first image of God tends to come from the child's father. Since the child's relation with the mother is so close biologically, the father is typically the first prominent, genuinely other person that the child comes to recognize as such. The young child tends to idealize this other and to project this image in the earliest stage of religious development. But this fact is part of the story, not the heart of the story. If we replace Freud's science-centered account with a spiritually centered one, we may interpret the child's early image of God as Father as a divinely designed evolutionary scaffolding to be gradually outshone by an increasingly spiritual realization of God's parental love. In this interpretation, the fatherhood of God can be both an evolutionary image arising in the natural mind and also as a spiritual truth. In other words, early in life, the father concept of God is a metaphor based on the child's experience of the earthly father. However, in a spiritually maturing person who continues to relate with God as Father, images from childhood may be left behind. The image of the Creator as an old man with flowing white hair and beard is portrayed in a stunning painting by William Blake, The Ancient of Days. Spiritual maturity may be moved by such art, but it can also freely relate without such images. A spiritually mature concept of God as our Father is not a gendered metaphor projecting a social image of a biological male. The spiritually mature concept is not a metaphor or image at all, but rather a realization of relationship. To be sure, any concept will always be short of the mystery of God's infinite and eternal nature. The vast literature on this topic generally affirms the equality of women with men and shows growing recognition of the motherly love of God. The next quote is from chapter 2 on philosophical living. And here I'm talking about the concept of meaning. And this portion of it on page 54 goes as follows. Culture wars are, in a way, struggles over meaning. and when they generate intolerance for people because of diverse usage of terms, meaning suffers. Language must change over time, and intelligent criticism helps us to make those changes thoughtfully and responsibly. Thus, high-quality thinking seeks humane expression in a public arena, rent by the claims of opposing groups. Culture wars involving religion obscure divine meaning. Everything is pulled down to the level of the social political struggle. If we were to jettison every word whose history reveals associated abuses, we would disconnect ourselves from the deeper concepts and experiences that some of these words symbolize, and our ability to think, understand, and communicate would be hampered. It is often wiser to keep terms that refer to something real and important. The language of conceptual clarity differs from the language of preaching, proclamation. A central truth set forth in this new philosophy of living is expressed in the phrase, the universal family. But in my view, the conceptual core of this phrase is more clearly expressed in terms of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. In many circles, we have been taught that this terminology is sexist, a legacy of religion's complicity with a patriarchal social order. Should we therefore withdraw all use of such terminology? After all, a great truth can be expressed in other ways. Much of the meaning of the concept of the family of God can be communicated by speaking of the parental love of God and the siblinghood or solidarity of humankind. And people have other reasons for naming God in language that expresses various concepts. But those who have rejected or are doubtful about the Father concept of God deserve some clarification to remove barriers and open the way to a new understanding. Here is one woman's perspective on the matter. Many women have problems with the religious use of father language, and the men who love and support them often share their concern. But one of the deeper problems underlying the reaction to so-called sexist terminology often remains hidden or untended to. Speaking from my own experience, which I believe is common among women, for most of my life, I wanted nothing to do with the idea of God as Father because my relationship with my own father was so troubled. Of what use would a male God be to me? That would be the last place I would look to find nurture, understanding, unconditional love. Decades of psychological and meditative therapies and processes to try to heal the father wound resulted in almost no change. It took a radical inner revelation in my early 50s of God as Father for the real healing to begin. And we're not talking here about the old man in the sky with a long beard, a punitive and scary God that so many little girls have grown up being told they must obey or else. Even though my father was no longer on this earth when I had that revelation, I became aware from a succession of dreams that after a profound healing had taken place between us, I became aware from a succession of dreams after that, a profound healing had taken place between us. And I could see the results in my relationships with men, which became much healthier and more stable after that. For many seekers of truth, both women and men, the necessary rejection of immature and often damaging notions of God accumulated in childhood has unfortunately slammed the door on a true inquiry into the nature of God as Father. But it's never too late to open that door again. As someone who spent 30 years on an Eastern spiritual path that is not God-centered, I can say that there is no contradiction between the realization of the absolute and the recognition that one is a son or daughter of a personal God. To me, this is the true vision of East meeting West. The last quote is from chapter 3 on spiritual living. Page 76. Jesus' life and teachings demonstrated core spiritual truths recognized in many religions. The goodness and love of the one Creator God, the presence of the divine Spirit within us, experiencing God in prayer and worship, the joy and liberation of the life of faith, meaning that helps us go through suffering, and commitment to treat others with respect and compassion, and humankind as a family. Even the happy mystery of the fatherhood of God has been recognized in many religions. I'm going to go to my footnote here. We find expression of the fatherhood of God in the Hebrew scriptures, from Moses to Malachi. In Confucianism, the most valued text by Chuang-Tzu begins with these words: "Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother." The 13th century Japanese Buddhist prophet Nichiren wrote in his dedication to the lotus, "Our hearts ache, and our sleeves are wet until we see face to face the tender figure of the one who says to us, 'I am thy Father.'" The most dynamic late 20th century expression of faith in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the glory of the indwelling Spirit of God has been the thousands of Swadhyay self-study villages that thrive mostly in Western India in response to the leadership of Hindu teacher Pandurang Shastri Artabale, who in 1957 started a movement of communities effectively devoted to worship, study, and social service. Today, returning to the text, today, the recognition of the universal family is expanding. In addition to experiencing divinely fatherly love, with its greater emphasis on purpose, creative design, and will, we experience divinely motherly love, with its greater emphasis on personal, responsive, expressive, merciful, encompassing, hands-on, nurturing qualities. These varieties in the expression of divine love should not lead back to the polytheism transcended by Jews, Muslims, and others. The more we live the truths of the universal family, the more the truth of the unity of God becomes a reality in our experience. In my view, that unity is expanded, not broken, by this testimony from 19th century preacher Rebecca Jackson. I saw that night for the first time a mother in the deity. This indeed was a new scene, a new doctrine to me, but I knowed when I got it, and I was obedient to the heavenly vision. And was I not glad when I found that I had a mother? And that night she gave me a tongue to tell it. The spirit of weeping was upon me, and it fell on all the assembly. And though they had never heard it before, I was made able by her Holy Spirit of wisdom to make it so plain that a child could understand it. As I realize now, I have spoken to the concept of the motherhood of God. Not for the last time. And so for now, whatever is going on in your life and in our world, always know that you are a divinely created, infinitely loved child of God, indwelt by the precious presence of his Spirit within. And as an evolutionary free will son or daughter of God, you have the privilege of living as a brother or sister to every personality you meet. Good day.